Okay, friends, I think it's time to finish this book, don't you? Okay, here. Now remember what happened. She ran away and nobody knows why. It's like a mystery, but she had a big idea. It said an idea hit Rosie's brain like thunder. And what an idea! She took off the paint glove and handed it to Aunt Rose. Don't let anyone touch that canvas, said Rosie. I'll be back. And with that, Rosie ran down the street and was gone. Okay. Here it says light, but she crossed out that spelling because this is the correct dictionary spelling. Light, not heavy, heavy. Light, not heavy, heavy. Rosie ran down Milk Lane, past Wells Drive, to Rains Street, with Gizmo zooming behind her. She stopped to catch her breath, then went to Mrs. Lou's house. Mrs. Lou's house. Rosie climbed the porch steps. Then she took another deep breath. She was nervous. She knew how to help June, but she needed Mrs. Lou's help. What if Mrs. Lou said no? Rosie wished she was back at the library with Ada, Iggy, and the Riveters. She almost turned around to leave, but then she thought about June. She had promised to do her part. Rosie had to be brave. You can do it, Rosie said to herself. Gizmo perched on Rosie's shoulder and chirped. I know, said Rosie, and she rang the doorbell. Rosie waited. No answer. She rang again. No answer. She knocked loudly. Hello, she yelled. Mrs. Lou? Silence. Rosie's heart sank. She turned away from the door. Suddenly, Gizmo flew in front of her. She flapped her wings furiously and looped the loop, blocking Rosie's way. What's wrong? Asked Rosie. Chirp, chirp, chirp. Stop it, Gizmo, said Rosie. Chirp, chirp. Crackle. Rosie heard a strange noise behind her. Crackle. Hello, said a faint, scratchy voice. It came from a box in the corner of the porch. Rosie looked into the box. A purple metal goose looked back at her with googly eyes. Crackle. Stay there, said a scratchy voice. It came from the metal goose. Rosie leaned closer. Just then the door opened. Mrs. Lou stepped outside. She held a strange walkie-talkie handset. Sorry, she said. My goosey-talkie is not working. She pushed a button on the back of the goose. She clicked a button on her handset. The goose's beak snapped open. Crackle. Hello? Hello? Mrs. Lou spoke into her handset, and her voice came out of the goose's mouth. That's more like it. Then she tossed the handset into the box and smiled. Hello, Rosie, she said. Glad to see you. Rosie was shocked. Friends, why do you think she was shocked? Just a page ago it said Rosie was nervous. And now she was nervous because she was nervous about Mrs. Lou. And now she's saying, the author is saying Rosie is shocked. Mrs. Lou was so friendly. Rosie thought about how Mrs. Lou had shut the curtains on her and how she sneaked like a shadow in the garden. Rosie looked at her neighbor and felt more nervous than ever. Friends, don't you love when an author both shows and tells us how a character might be feeling? This author is really good at that. She shows it by, telling us what's going on and what their body language might be, but she also tells us what the characters are feeling. Rosie looked at her neighbor and felt more nervous than ever. She said. Yes? Asked Mrs. Lou. Rosie took another deep breath and remembered why she was there. I need your help, she said. Mrs. Lou smiled. I thought you'd never ask. Chapter 18. And it says, fluffy end, pampas grass, stalk, hollow and light, so the stalk is hollow and light. Paint can flow up the stalk and onto the fluffy end. Chapter 18. Beep, beep! The old army jeep zoomed around the corner and toward the library. A load of pampas stalks bounced around in the back of the jeep. Beep, beep! The Jeep screeched to a halt a few feet from June's canvas. Would you look at that? Cried Boss. It's Agnes Lou! And Rosie, said Ada. She and Iggy ran to the Jeep. Rosie, they said. What's going on? Rosie flipped open the glove box and Gizmo hopped out. She chirped happily and flew to the top of the canvas. June needed lighter brushes, Rosie said, so I asked Mrs. Lou if we could use one of the pampas stalks from her garden. She cut them all down. Mrs. Lou and Rosie jumped out of the Jeep and grabbed a bunch of plumes from the back. Agnes Lou, said Aunt Rose, what have you done to your beautiful garden? Doesn't matter, said Mrs. Lou. When a riveter needs something, I do my part. June needs these more than I do. She pulled a pair of shears from the pocket of her duster and trimmed one of the stalks. They're lighter than those curtain rods, said Mrs. Lou, though I would have tried curtain rods too. It was a good design. Rosie looked confused. You design things? She asked. Mrs. Lou laughed. Well, of course I do, she said. I'm an engineer too, and we engineers have to help each other. That's why I left the bucket of tubes and tape for you. Rosie thought those had come from Ada and Iggy or the recyclers, Bee and Bo. She had so many questions, but no time to ask them. Aunt Rose and the Riveters crowded in to give Mrs. Lou hugs. They all knew her. Your poor garden, said June. What were you thinking? Mrs. Lou raised her hand. Not another word, she said. It's time to paint. Mrs. Lou handed Rosie a stalk, and Rosie got busy. Within moments, June was painting again. She swished the brushes this way and that. It was beautiful. Then, snap! The red stem broke. Uh-oh, said Rosie. That's why we brought extras, said Mrs. Lou. Look. Chapter 19. It says things that have rivets. Ships, airplanes, jeeps, jeans. Solid rivet, round rivets, round, countersunk, flat, pan. These are all kinds of rivets. Chapter 19. Rosie swapped in a new stalk and June kept painting. After a few minutes, the blue stem snapped, but Rosie was ready with a replacement. As other stems broke, Rosie swapped them too. Meanwhile, Rosie, Ada, and Iggy learned more about the mysterious Mrs. Lou. Boss explained that Mrs. Lou was a riveter in the Jeep factory on the other side of the river from the airplane factory. I made this very Jeep, said Mrs. Lou. I learned a lot about machines during the war. It made me want to invent some, so I did. Haven't stopped since. Rosie was amazed. All this time, she had lived next door to another engineer and didn't know it? Mrs. Lou seemed to read her mind. You didn't know because I rarely get out of the house except at night, she said. I have a skin condition that makes me allergic to sunlight. It's why I wear this crazy garb. Can't let the sun hit me. Is that why you keep your curtains shut? Asked Rosie. Yes, said Mrs. Lou. But your Aunt Rose lets me know when you've got a project, and I donate what I can to help. I'm glad you like the crates I leave at your house. You do that? Asked Rosie. Of course, said Mrs. Lou. Did you think it was the Tooth Fairy? More like the Tool Fairy, said Aunt Rose. Ho, that's a good one. Aunt Rose slapped her knee and laughed out loud. She laughed until she wheezed and her eyes filled with tears. Soon the whole group was laughing. No one laughed harder than Mrs. Lou. Rosie realized that she'd been very wrong about Mrs. Lou. She thought Mrs. Lou was mean and mysterious and did not like her. She should have given Mrs. Lou a chance. Mrs. Lou smiled at Rosie. You know, Rosie, she said, I could use your help with a doohickey I made to scrub the dishes. It's simply smashing. It sounds amazing, said Rosie. No, said Mrs. Lou, it is simply smashing all my plates, and now I'm almost out of bowls. She laughed again. Rosie laughed too. I'd love to help, said Rosie. It's good to have an engineer for a neighbor, said Mrs. Lou. Rosie smiled back. It is indeed. Oops. There we go. The next chapter is chapter 20. Coming soon.